Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is Forias, and this is my co-host, MysterE. So, MysterE, how are you going today?
I am very well for IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. And another interesting topic today. I guess since we were talking about last time the working class in the 21st century, that does bring up the interesting question of is wage work slavery? Because that is a common
Yeah.
term that happens, like being a wage slave. So
Mm, mm.
it's
Yeah.
linked.
I feel like it's kind of I don't know, almost a loaded term or something that is like easy for people to dismiss as like, just general like leftist rhetoric or
Mm,
socialist propaganda or something like that. And so people just, brush it to the side as some type of conspiracy
yeah.
theory kind of stuff almost, uh, which I think is, well, wrong. It's a very
Mm,
apt description of our current kind of social existence. And then considering it like in these kind of conspiracy theory kind of terms, because I guess it's confronting
yeah.
when people hear, or have their existence reduced to a form of slavery. Their instant reaction is to be like, "Hey, thought I was free, man," like kind of thing. So like it's confronting, but like people are quick to reject that notion and defend their circumstances, and like that only plays into the hands of the 1% or our economic rulers, the capitalist class, all that sort of description of the establishment and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's very, very poignant and very important for us to get a hold on this conversation, especially for all of our listeners out there.
Yeah, and maybe this might prompt us to, or at least show the listeners and the viewers as to what we're talking about. I actually was listening to the recent video that Richard Wolff had, and I think he kind of encapsulates this idea quite well.
Mm,
So what he actually said during that episode was, we have to say these socialists, we have to change the organization of production. We have to go back to the basics. If capitalism is the relationship employer, the minority, and the exploited majority, employees, if it has that structure in common with the lord and the serf and the master and the slave, then that's the problem. That the solution to the difficulties, the inequalities of capitalism, is to not allow that basic structure to continue.
mm,
So, what I believe he's saying, and at least what socialism is basically saying, like the broad church of it, is which is probably a Karl Marx esque Das Kapital thing to say, is that really wage slavery, or at least that concept, what it's saying is that, well, the basic premise of a hierarchical structure, whether you look back to a slave and a master leading to a serf and a landlord or a lord,
yeah, yeah,
leading into employer employee, that fundamental structure hasn't really changed. Where you
yeah,
have one group, a minority, that's holding the means of production,
yeah.
to the other group that is the majority that is
Mm,
basically being exploited whilst producing that means of production.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's the minority that holds everything, and the majority that doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. The whole wage slavery idea is obviously built on that very fundamental notion that there is a group in society, like, and usually the majority of people, that produces all of the things that everybody needs. The laborer or the laboring class,
Mm.
and then that allows a whole group of people in society usually a minority or less than the labouring class, to then kind of live off the fruits of their labour, and then to be able to spend their time doing other things. So, like some people, philosophers, political economists have described that as like a leisure class, because they're
Mm.
not toiling and they're not spending all their time kind of making things that help everyone else survive, including, themselves. But like, classes like this leisure class, and like, other anthropologists and like, political commentators will say it's like it enables the formation of a political class. So people that are just
Mm.
involved in politics, or an economic class, people just involved in like commerce, and like some people would say then that there's ability to have like an artistic class. So people that just spend their life on, acting and making visual art
Mm.
or music and things like that. So, like our understanding of society in that sense, of complex societies, let's call them, it really, everything pins on having, people that make all of this stuff, and then you allow certain groups of people to specialize in other things, and live off the products, which
Yes.
we would call nowadays, like GDP or something like that, gross domestic product, all the services and all the goods that are produced and traded and
Mm.
stuff. So some people can specialize in certain things. I think that really is a very, it's a very Marxist notion. But I think it's kind of accepted by a lot of people, potentially even people that would be like, anti-Marxist. There was a lot of kind of,
Mm.
political economy and philosophy that developed over the last couple of hundred years that was built around this entire notion. Like people kind of just understood that, but they might not have used that as a platform to, advocate for socialist change or something like that. They just use
Yes.
that as a framework to analyze and interpret society. So, like, it's not too far-fetched then to make the stretch to say that the people, the working class or working people, are like kind of slaves to that system.
Mm.
It's not too far of a stretch to go there. Like, you only have to go back like a few hundred years ago at the dawn of industrial capitalism, right?
Mm.
And like, Chomsky talks about this a lot. There were a lot of like articles and like, what is it, like, newspaper articles or journal articles being written by people that had previously been, artisans or like self-employed. So petty
Mm.
bourgeois kind of people, and they were being kind of torn away from their guilds and their professions, into like the factory system, let's say
Yes.
the industrial capitalist system. And they were absolutely appalled by the idea that like you would trade your time for a wage. They
Mm.
thought like immediately their first reaction as autonomous people that had kind of lived as like a free existence, because they kind
Yeah.
of just, they did their own thing and they survived. They like still, participated in the economy, but they didn't have to trade their time for money in some monotonous or mindless task where they're just part of a production line,
Yeah.
and or doing the same thing day in and day out, or the same specific task where it's just repetitive action and all that sort of stuff, which is what
Yeah.
most people are subjected to today. Doesn't matter the complexity of what they're working on, they kind of do the same thing over and over again. They thought that was mindless, and they thought
Mm.
that was a form of slavery, and they were like, it's unequivocal. It's a form of slavery. You can call
Yeah.
it wage slavery if you want, you can call it chattel slavery if you want. Like,
Mm.
it doesn't matter. If you are working for someone else, usually on something that you're not particularly interested in or anything like that, or you don't have your heart set on it, and you're just getting getting paid off for that by the hour,
Yes.
just so you can have enough to survive, like buy food, maybe some accommodation, the occasional luxury.
Yes.
That's not a free existence.
Well,
That you're
that's
not a
probably
free person.
well, yeah, that's probably the associated term to all of this is that, well, if you are talking about wage slavery, you therefore have to connect that to the idea of the alienation from your work. which
Yeah.
would have been a related concept. But really, when you think about it, uh, the idea of wage slavery, it's supposed to be like a bucket of cold water on your face, because
Mm,
essentially this might be a bit of a David Harvey idea, but when you do consider capitalism, or you do consider like market economies and these sort
mm,
of things, they basically have a they like to emphasize themselves in kind of being natural, and
yeah.
also
Yeah.
what they like. It's not the individual parts that show this sort of like exploitation, if you will. As David Harvey would say, you have to look at things in the totality.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the obvious part to you would probably be, or at least what you would consider natural, is, well, oh, well, I have to go to work, otherwise I can't afford the things that I consume. I can't subsist. But to be
Mm,
honest, like the businesses that function in this, the the fact that the slightest thing in, say, for example, cost of living going up, or the various actors within this structure, they're basically kind of passing the buck of like, well, we got to do our thing because that's the way it is, or we got to do our thing because that's the way it is. And I guess it ends up being quite pernicious, because the exploitation isn't obvious,
it's not
like in
explicit.
the, yeah.
No, it's not explicit at all. And I think there's a lot of social conditioning as well that has helped,
Mm,
frame that. I think exploitation is a really good concept to bring up, because that's how people see a slave society. If you take someone, like, basically against their will, and you put them into a slave arrangement where they are subject to a master, like, in the totality, if we can continue
mm.
using that awesome word, it's going to be word of the day here on the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast, the totality. I love when David Harvey says that. I get a chill every time he says it. I'm like, oh, do it again, David. Um, you know what I'm saying? Like, in that sense, like exploitation, okay,
Mm,
that's really what is like kind of the core element of what's going on here. If
yeah.
you have a system where you've got someone that is working underneath you at like your direction as a master and a slave kind of thing, and you can really control their lives, you can actually decide whether they live or die. You can do whatever you want
Mm,
with them. They're your property kind of thing. There is a very special kind of power balance and relationship going there. And like that exists on using somebody else's work to allow you to do kind of what it is that you want to do. Now, there's
mm,
nothing different in the capitalist system there. If you have people employed underneath you who are creating, goods or services, they're adding value to your enterprise, and you get to control that enterprise like in a totalitarian way, then
mm,
like there's no difference in that power balance, because you're paying them. Okay, they may have the decision to go to another workplace, and that's where people think that they're free, but like, where they're going to just go to some other employer that kind of might
mm,
treat them a little bit better, but like they're still being exploited, because whatever they're producing is being taken from them and
mm,
like given back to them for a nominal fee. So there's like exploitation is a central feature in that system. I think where most people like would kind of fail to want to recognize the exploitation is like, oh yeah,
yes.
but I have choice, right? I have that freedom to, go somewhere else if I want, or I'll
Mm,
start my own business. But like, there's all this kind of rhetoric in the business community themselves, like 90% of like new businesses fold within the first 3 years and all that
yeah.
sort of stuff. So it's not like it's just, so easy to kind of just step in and make it on your own. Like the way that society has come and advanced over the last like few hundred years, like the majority of people are kind of like employed in medium to large scale kind of businesses and
Mm,
undertakings, whether that's government services or something else. But they're part of larger enterprises. Like small businesses work a lot off like kind of, let's say, family exploitation or like exploiting their communities and stuff like that. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean
Mm.
exploitation in a neutral term. It's exploitative because they are kind of pooling resources off the loved ones or the people that are closest to them to try and get the work they need done to get the business off the ground. So like exploitation is inherent
Mm.
in the system, I think. And that's why the kind of slavery element, you could say, is an apt description of it.
Yeah.
Because I do think that it takes away an element of people's freedom. Like you have to look at like the wage system, especially the way that like we've
Mm.
got it today. It used to be worse, I would say. Well, actually, it depends on what country you're in. But like, let's
Yeah.
just say developed Western nations, like it used to be kind of worse. Like you really went to work potentially like 20 hours a day. You might have only had 4 hours of sleep between your shifts. You might not have
Mm.
even gone home. You might have just slept on the factory floor at one point. Children were as part of that system, men, women, it didn't discriminate kind of thing.
Mm.
And like you kind of just gave your life up to that service so you could, I guess, afford food and maybe a pretty crappy place to live in.
Yes.
If you ever really went home, maybe you had like one day off a week or something like that. And so like today we've got like kind of standards thanks to, industrial
Yes.
relations and like, union efforts and things like that. So like people still though trade, let's just say the average like 8-hour
Mm.
working day, 5 days a week. You're not free in that
Yeah.
circumstance because what humans kind of do, like I would say more naturally or in a more natural state, is like they have social connections. I
Yes.
don't mean social relations in the Marxist term. I mean like actual social connections. They have family, friends,
Mm.
loved ones, people they want to interact with, their children, their parents,
Yes.
whatever. And like if you are being torn away from that 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, and then so you need a lot of time to kind of rest and recover, like
Mm.
you're being cut off from your human kind of existence.
Yes.
So like even if it's only for part of the day or something like that, it's usually like the most productive part of the day or the part where you're most conscious and you're most active.
Yes.
So are you really free? Yeah, okay, fine. You might have entered into
Mm.
that agreement. You might have signed a contract. You might have, joined that company or whatever. But like, you're not doing what you feel like 5 days a week.
Yes.
Are you really free?
Yeah, because no, you do raise a really good point there. Because really, not to discredit the achievements of the unions and like basically all the sweat and tears of the workers that came before us. That really, the thing is, obviously, it was great. Great thing to get the benefits as the 8-hour working day, sick leave, annual leave, all of these things that really we take for granted. But the fact of the matter is that whilst we did get those benefits, the structure of the employer and the employee relationship that hasn't particularly changed that much,
Mm,
especially in a liberal democracy that we kind of exist in, at least in Western countries, more advanced countries. What I would say though is this is where we're probably more approaching what is the usual spiel of people such as Richard Wolff, is that, well, the thing is, we go to elections and we vote, but the thing is, um, our workplaces are not as democratic, and really, you could make the argument that a majority of our lives we're actually spending at work.
yeah.
So that's when he comes in with his ideas of
Mm,
cooperatives, where really, if we want to change this idea or move away from considering such things as wage slavery, instead of I guess the means of production, or at least the profits of your work being in the hands of the employer or the minority in your workplace, you should collectivize, where you work out 4 days a week, you do your task, and then on the Friday or one day a week, you work out with everyone in a group meeting what you're going to produce, how you're going to produce, and what to do with the profits.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
obviously, that is not the end goal, because I guess if you're in socialist spaces, like the whole point of socialism is to lead to the commune, or at least lead to communism as the
Yeah.
final goal. But it's at least changing that relationship, or at least it's an idea to change that employer mindset.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a great way of looking at it. Like, we love democracy, right, in this
Mm.
age. Um, so why does that not extend beyond our work? Our, like, from our political lives or our general life
Mm.
into our working life, which is, what takes up most of our time, which is what we're saying here.
Mm.
Why aren't we also enjoying democracy in the workplace?
Yes.
It's a really basic question, but one that's so profound, because it's kind of like a workplace in the modern day is set up like a totalitarian structure. So it's
Yes.
fully top down kind of approach. And it's not just authoritarian because it's, you're just taking orders from the hierarchy. It's totalitarian in, like, you all look the same. Also, like, if you work in an office, you all wear office attire, or if you work in
Mm.
some other place where there's a uniform, you all wear the same stuff, or people in certain groups in the organization wear certain things. You all have
Mm.
to kind of use the same language. You'll use, you all talk shop. Everyone knows the terminology and the acronyms that you're using, and like all that
Mm.
sort of stuff. And like, you all kind of have to think the same, because everyone's kind of ruled over by a code of conduct. So you can't just say whatever you want and speak to whoever you want the way you want, because you have to think the same as well. Like, it's complete
Mm.
kind of, it's a totalitarian way of living, because we spend a lot of our time in the workplace, so we are subject to that structure. But like, I want to kind of turn the discussion though
Yeah.
into like more of a look at slavery. So
Yes.
like, for any of you out there that are familiar with the works of Graeber, he does some brilliant work with David Wengrow, um,
Mm.
in a book called The Dawn of Everything.
Mm.
And like, even his work in Debt, the first 5,000 years, kind of looks specifically at the idea. These two works, if you read them together, kind of look a lot at the idea of slavery. And like, there is some very interesting kind of origins of slavery, and I think we kind of have to
Mm.
understand the origin of slavery, and it will really inform our discussion of the viewer and the listeners kind of decision about whether to take wage slavery seriously or not. But like,
Yeah.
slavery didn't just start in, like, those ancient societies we were talking about before, like, ancient Rome or ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, where, they're really famous for being kind of structured on the back of a slave class that does all the menial stuff. So I guess the other people can kind of get on with what they want to do, be part of the culture, and all that sort of stuff. It actually came from kind of, more primitive societies, let's say, or less complex
Mm.
societies, where, like, people were living in tribes or chiefdoms and all that sort of stuff. And it was actually a reaction to egalitarian life. So like,
Mm.
if you lived in, like, let's say like a small community, a tribe or something like that, you actually had a lot of freedom, right? So like, they were egalitarian, like, people would get together and make collectivized decisions.
Mm.
Everyone would work, but they'd share the fruits of their labor, like all that sort of stuff, blah, 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 blah. Primitive communism, as the Marxists would refer to it. But
Mm.
like, in that sort of social structure, because it's pretty equal, even if you do have like social inequalities, right? You do have people that are from more prominent families, maybe they're from the line of the chief, or you have people that just have higher social standings and stuff like that. And like, unless you are just like so charismatic or just so good with your kind of negotiation skills, you can convince other people in that society, in your tribe kind of thing, to do stuff for you. Unless you could convince them of that, you are unable to elevate yourself to that leisure class I was describing before, where you
Yeah.
don't actually have to do any of the rudimental kind of work, like the stuff that sustains you. But if you're unable to convince others, what do? If you want to be in the leisure class, you raid your neighboring tribe and steal people. And that's where the idea of slavery came from. And like this was very prominent, like for kind of, I guess you would call them explorers or people that, Europeans that basically went to the Americas. They found a lot of Native American kind of populations and stuff that had slavery. Like they were
Yeah.
really free kind of people, but they dabbled in slavery, and they had a whole system, like a way of life built around like taking or stealing people from each other so that person or those people could work for them. So like slavery has this weird origin as a byproduct of freedom. People like the commoners in a tribe or like a chieftain or something like that was so free that like if someone more prominent than them said like, hey, go fish for me or like go gather my stuff for me, they'd be like, no, not doing it. So then they'd have to like kind of put together like a war party or a council or something like that, and like a group of people, and basically steal people from somebody else's tribe, and then those people would be taken into slavery, and then like if they were completely disconnected from their place of origin, you could control them and get them to do what you want. But they kind of kept them like pets, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like they didn't treat them like an underclass exactly, just there to kind of, feed the whole system for them so they could all enjoy the fruits of just one laboring class. People had them like in their houses as like a pet. So like, they'll go fetch the water today and they'll collect the sticks for the fire and all that sort of stuff. But like they kind of had ownership of them, and they like, braided their hair and like, decorated them and stuff like that. But like they had this kind of understanding in these kind of Native American kind of societies that like if you take a slave or you take a person, let's say, to do that stuff that you don't want to do, you're basically, they would refer to it as eating their life force. Yes. So if you're getting them to do all the menial tasks so you can do something else and spend your time on leisure, let's say, then you're in effect, if they're producing like food for you or something, you're eating them. That's how they thought of it, because like they are producing you food and they're giving it to you and you get to consume it. You are eating that person. So the inherent understanding, which is what we were talking about just before, is that it's based on exploitation. But like you kind of protected them and you kept them as a pet and all that sort of stuff. Like, people have dogs to guard the house or like, guard their property or something like that. But it's an exploitative relationship, and there's a full understanding of that. And like a necessary kind of recognition that like if you don't want to do something, well then you force somebody else to do it for you. And that's not changed.
Yes, and I'm very glad that you brought up Dead the First 5,000 Years, because it's been a while since I've read the book, but I do remember when he is kind of going through the history of debt. And well, his huge claim in the book is that, well, actually, it wasn't just barter, a barter society, and then we went we went to where we are now today. No, debt was the thing that was established, like what we would consider as modern society. And really, when you do consider slavery, or you do at least what you would consider wage slavery in our modern society. But sorry to jump ahead of what you were talking about, but like just to kind of go back with what I was saying before about the totality of the system, is that what a lot of people, I guess, don't really consider until it's really forced in front of them and exposed to them, is that there's just so many things in our society that reinforce us being in debt in order to keep the system running.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, hey, you got out of high school and then you were told to get a good job, and then suddenly you were on your way to a profession, and then you decided to get, say, a loan from the government, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe you just had to get a loan from a bank,
I know where you're going with this for us.
and then suddenly you have a credit card and you have a debt, and then once you
Yeah.
finally get your job, you spend the rest of your time paying off the debt that you apparently owed the society because of
Mm-hmm.
reasons. And this all has origins to what you were saying before. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I want to reinforce the David Harvey idea of you have to look at the totality of the situation,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
really, at the end of the day, if you look at uh, individual parts, they're like, oh, well, this is how things work. And it's because I do it because the other person expects me to do it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting concept looking at it as the totality, because you can just look at like the working relationship between employer and worker or something like that as a free exchange, because there's two parties that are coming together in that system, and they agree to something, and there's a trade-off and all that sort of stuff. But like if you take a step back and you look at the reason why that worker is going to that employer and they're massively in debt, then like do they really have a choice but to go and like get a job straight away and start paying that back? Like maybe they don't have the ability to wait 5 years to start off their own business and see it turning a profit for the first time before they can pay back their debts. They're kind of forced into kind of just getting that money straight away. And most people will sell themselves to, a system of employment for whoever that may be. It doesn't just have to be like a company or something like that. They could be working for anyone for a fee. And in order to pay back these debts that they've accumulated, living in a market system with, and a monetary society. And so like moving on then from like, I think what you're referring to in the debt situation is where you have kind of more complex societies being built, complex, that's when you have slavery associated to debt. So before it
yeah.
was like kind of just feeding off someone's life force before. So you just steal somebody else's people so you don't have to produce your own people. They probably won't listen to you anyway. And it turns into kind of a more property relation. For the first
Yes.
time, slavery is more seen as like, instead of just stealing someone and looking after them and getting them to work for you, you kind of see it as a property and a commerce thing. You kind of trade money or resources for people. Don't get me wrong, there's still, militaries involved, and you basically attack someone in the ancient world and
Yeah.
steal half of their population and force them into servitude. But that was just the mechanism to get them into the market.
Yes.
Okay, so like into the property relationship, it wasn't because you were just taking people to look after them, have them work for you. It was a market kind of dynamic. And so like I think it's in Sumeria, the ancient Sumerian culture is kind of the first time that you have kind of this word for freedom appearing. And it's like, pretty sure the word was amagi, which
Right.
means return to one's mother. So like in Sumerian society, where they started to use like kind of, I guess, very basic forms of money, centered around debt, which is what you were talking about before, you had people that kind of had to, maybe sell themselves because they couldn't pay back a debt. They had like,
Yeah.
borrowed money from the state or from like maybe someone who had more money to kind of run their farm, and like they had a bad yield. They couldn't pay it back like they thought they were going to. And so they couldn't pay it back. They became a debt peon. So they had to
Yes.
work off their debt. And the only way to do that was to put themselves into somebody else's servitude. Basically, they just had to go and work for someone else in a master-slave kind of relationship. And like every now and again, you'd have this ruler come in because like, that system was getting out of hand, right? So like
Yes.
debt was accumulating and more people were going into slavery, and people were getting, there was unrest, civil unrest, and people were starting to get angry about it. And every now and again, you just have a ruler that would come over and like kind of tell the ruling kind of elite of that society, the people that controlled the economics of it, or the political upper classes and stuff. And they were just like, look, we're going to have to let these people kind of go, because if they get too pissed off, they're just going to kill us all anyway, and we'll lose everything. So the ruler would come in every now and again and be like, you're all free. And they would cancel out debts. And so
Yes.
this word amagi means like return to your mum, return to your families, go back to your
Yes.
people. The debts have been cancelled. Let's just start again. And like, don't get me wrong, the system would just start up again and everyone would be in debt,
Yes.
you know, after like a couple of generations or something, but they would dismiss it. They would write off debts. And so like a big part of kind of the understanding of what slavery is, like fundamentally, when you are owned by someone else and they are your master, you the essence of what being a slave is you aren't allowed to have social connections anymore. So you're cut off from being able to make friendships, like basic relationships. You can't just get like married and actually be in like indebted to somebody else in that way. Like, you know how when people form a marital kind of arrangement, they like kind of have like reciprocal rights over each other. You can't do
Yes.
any of that sort of stuff when you're a slave, and you can't have like, family. You can't be with your people whenever you choose. You're cut off. And so they refer to slavery, or people, anthropologists refer to slavery as experiencing a social death. So you're
Yeah.
dead socially when you're a slave. You have no control over your person. You can't connect with other people. Sorry, you were going to
No, no.
say
All
something.
I was going to say is I'm kind of glad that you explained that term as returning to the mother, because when you first said that to me and I heard that term, I immediately took the more cynical route, and I thought, oh, you'll return when you're dead. That's
Ha.
that's what
Yeah,
that's
well,
what I
like that's the
took.
thing. A lot of people would die in servitude. They wouldn't
Yeah.
actually make it out to the other side, especially if like they were treated like property, which is what you get much later on. Or like you still have it then, but like you get that developing into a very warped culture in like, the chattel slavery arrangements that happened
Yes.
in like the capitalist era, like in the American South and the colonial kind of in the colonial kind of past that the West inherited most of its capitalist culture from. But like the word like I think it's really hard to separate like slavery from freedom, and which is what we were
Yes.
talking about before. But like the idea or the word for free in English comes from the Germanic word for friend.
Yes.
So if you're free, you can have friends. You can have social connections. If you're not free, like a slave, it severs your social ties. It cuts you off from the community. And we,
Yeah.
20 minutes ago when we were talking about wage slavery, we spent a bit of time going through the idea that if you're working all the time, you're being cut off from your family and your chosen social connections. Like the first thing people do on the weekend, on Friday night or, Saturday, is they go out and they like, they might go to the pub or hit a nightclub so they can go socialize, and then on Saturday they're out, having picnics or playing sport or, whatever they're doing, they're socializing. It's like the weekend is the culmination of this long period of servitude over the week, and people are liberated and they go out and they do stuff with other
Yes.
people. And even if they don't do stuff with other people in the 21st century, they might sit on their computers and like watch people on Twitch or listen to people like us ranting
Yes.
and raving on a podcast. Like they're still seeking social interaction, stuff that they can't get at work effectively. Like they can, like some people just stand around the water cooler all day, to use a cliche, and, pretend to work, but they're just talking. But like,
Yeah.
if the boss comes past, they scatter back to where they should be doing their jobs and stuff like that. So like, if you look at slavery as kind of like this product of freedom and like perversely then kind of, I don't know, connected to it somehow, then you can't shake the notion that wage slavery is a form of slavery, because you're being cut off from what you want to do, even if you're being paid for it. Like, it's just a very market way of looking at the world, which we're all subjected to living in a market society, to just think that, oh, well, like, I'm being paid for it, so it's okay. Like, who decided that trade-off was okay? I don't remember voting on that. Did you, 4IS? Because I didn't get a say in that one.
Very much so. I didn't vote on that. But there's another element of what you were talking about before that I want to drill down on, and that was the idea of, debt forgiveness, because otherwise your ruling classes would have a rebellion on their hands, or a revolt. And the funny thing is that, from the 20th century, hey, maybe even before that, we haven't probably had a proper revolution, at least in advanced countries, in a very, very long time. But what I would say is, definitely in our modern market economies, I don't think there's been any proper debt forgiveness that has kind of restarted this. Maybe using revolution in the more traditional sense, as in revolving around the sun, or at least hitting the reset button. Because the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of debt forgiveness recently is the global financial crisis, but not necessarily for the families that were in servitude, the ordinary people that were in servitude. It was
who got debt forgiveness? Who
got debt forgiveness were the rich people. Your people that basically, you could argue, made the crisis in the first place. They had their debt was
bloody oath, and paid for by the state and the people.
But really, leading to the stage which we're in the current, like, cost of living crisis, and pretty much it's been a snowball effect ever since the war in Ukraine and everything. Clearly, the people in power haven't learned from history, and I think what that flashpoint in 2008 showed is that instead of everyone being forgiven, only certain people were forgiven, and that you're not necessarily learning from your history in that regard.
No. Well, or you could even say that they have learned very well from their history, and they're going to make sure that it only goes to the people that control the means and have all the political sway. They make sure that if there is debt forgiveness, it goes to the top. What's the not old adage, but like very good one? Socialism for the rich. And
it's what was it? Privatize the profits, socialize the losses.
Losses, right? Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And I think that's a good kind of way to look at what happened in the GFC, right? So, like, they basically gambled with the economy, crashed it, and then needed to be bailed out, so the system didn't kind of crumble any further, and so they just got like massive payouts, injections of trillions of dollars, and then they all got bonuses and had super yacht parties or whatever it is that the 1% do, while like people kind of foreclosed on their mortgages, got kicked out of their homes, and went into like these crazy spirals of economic turmoil. And like, no one sat at the top of that political structure or had the kind of the balls to do it and just be like, well, look, you know what, instead of tens of thousands of people losing their homes in like the United States or something like that, said, no, don't lose your home, we'll just cancel out your mortgage, kind of thing, and we'll just start again. No, there was none of that kind of stuff for the average person. None of that at all. Which is like kind of the problem with wage slavery in a way, because like wage slavery kind of exists, like capitalism exists of having the wage worker. And so in the wage slavery system, you must have those people always indebted to the system somehow, or to a financial institution or whatever. Maybe they don't have any debts, but they still have to pay taxes to the government or something. They have to be kind of indebted, let's just use that word, to the system to make it, to incentivize working, because capitalism needs that to survive. But if you looked at like kind of the origins of where slavery came from in these like egalitarian societies, slavery didn't exist because they needed people to work, kind of thing, by having them feeding off the system, or incentivized in that manner. Slavery existed exactly in the opposite term, because commoners kind of had the freedom to say, no, I'm not doing work for you. And so you had to find slaves to do it, because commoners had a lot of power. And so in the wage work system, it's completely exploitative, in the sense that working people have no power to say, no, I'm not going to get a job and I'm not going to like do that, because if they don't feed into the system somehow, then like they just won't be able to survive in it. They won't be able to afford to live, the cost of living, like you were saying before.
Well, look, like probably as a final point that I want to make is that what is the first thing that you're talked about in terms of the real world when you're a kid? It's always about, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like, I wouldn't be like, oh, it might be in the sense of like, oh, if there's any place that you want to be, um sorry, is there any place you would like to live when you grow up? Like, it might be questions like that, but immediately your mind is set to, or at least conditioned to be like, hey, what sort of profession do you want to work towards?
Yeah.
Because
It's career oriented. It's not like, oh, you're really good at like this skill. Maybe you should develop that skill for the rest of your life and be really good at that thing, or your natural talents or something like that. It's like, you got to do something productive with your life. So start thinking about how you can contribute to society, basically,
yes,
which is
and
like
that's
by
kind of
getting a
the
job, though.
yes,
Yeah.
because really that's what that phrase saying what is priming you towards. It's like,
Yeah.
you look towards this profession, everything that you do in your life, from sorry for international listeners, but the HSC is basically the higher education, leaving high school. That's basically what our final exams are. So once you realize what you want to do in your profession, work towards it in your HSC, then work towards it in your new university years.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is that changing that what to who, for example, like, who do you want to be when you grow up? That's a completely different question.
It
And really,
is.
and what you could do with that question is like, oh, well, little Johnny, who do you want to be when you grow up? And it's like, oh, I want to be somebody who's brave. Then possibly you could be like, oh, do you, from there you can basically work on attributes or skills that you want to, and then maybe you might end up finding something that you consider more fulfilling in your life, or look, and to be honest, it could be stuff that's might be well-established professions. Like, I don't know, say for somebody who says that they want to be caring, maybe an established unionized profession like being a nursing or a teacher might end up being something that they want.
And
But
it's part
like,
of who they are, as opposed to just being that career focused kind of. But like the whole system you've just made me think is really designed to produce and replicate this wage slavery system. Like the original form of slavery, if it was just like stealing other people's to do your work, even in ancient slave societies, raiding, conquesting your neighbors or something like that, or a rival imperial force, and stealing half of their population so they work for you. You weren't gearing up your people for their entire lives to think, oh, how are they going to be a good worker or something like that. But like our whole educational system like the school, like even to like how it's like structured and stuff. You have bells and like certain meal times and like all that
Mm.
sort of stuff, to what you're actually taught as well at school is completely just gearing people up to go into the workforce. And so if you condition your entire society to kind of just be ready to be a worker, like
Mm.
they are the ultimate slaves. Like even in ancient Roman societies and stuff like that, you had your Spartacuses of the world who, like, you know, knew that they belonged somewhere else, and then they would have died to get back, to return to their mother, let's
Mm.
say. But like here, it's kind of just like, but all I know is to be a good worker.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't understand, like kind of thing.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
like it's actually kind of inbuilt into our consciousness today to want to contribute to that system and perpetuate it, because
Mm.
like everything's about like the next material good. So you have to be a good consumer, and to be a good consumer, you need money. And then to like really show that you've been an accomplished member of society, it's all about personal gain. So what you can do to increase your status in society by monetary means, of course, and then showing it off by keeping up with the Joneses. All of this stuff kind of reinforces the idea that you need to work to survive, and like productivity is paramount to everything.
Mm.
And so, like, if you just have that social conditioning around you all the time, you wouldn't see it as slavery. You wouldn't
Mm.
see it as slavery at all. But, like, you know, again, 200 years ago, like, which is not that far away, if you look at like human history kind of thing,
Mm.
like blip on the radar kind of stuff. Just 200 years ago, the average person was like, this system sucks. I'm not
Mm.
going to work. And like they would really, really band together to try and make sure as many people as possible who were partaking in that system from the bottom knew that that system sucked. And they,
Mm.
you know, they spent a lot of time advocating against it, and advocating for freedom. There's like this really kind of, I think it's like a famous saying from people around this time, a few hundred years ago in the Americas, who kind of moved over when, like, you know, the Americans were being colonized and stuff like that, and they got out of Europe. They got out of the misery that was like feudal Europe and absolutist monarchy Europe, and they escaped kind of to the new colonies and set up lives for themselves. There was land and all this sort of stuff, and they
Mm.
set themselves up and they lived kind of, you know, free existences. And when they were kind of forced into the industrial capitalist system as it was taking over the east coast of America, they kind of said, their motto was like, because in Europe, based in the miserable
Mm.
conditions where people were coming from, they always called out for bread, right? You know,
Yeah.
give us bread, because they didn't want to starve. But the Americans weren't used to that. Like they had bread, they were actually living quite, you know, free existences, let's call it. And they said, give us not bread, but roses. And I think that's why when you see that socialist, that very I can't remember the name of them, but like they're a very popular socialist organization. It's a hand holding a rose,
Mm.
and the rose is supposed to symbolize, it's not just about survival, it's not just about bread, but it's about the things in life that really matter: social
Mm.
connections, art, culture, being human. So not just give us bread, give us roses, give us back our humanity and our connection to society and the world around us. We're not just slaves who
Mm.
work 5 days a week and have a couple of days off to catch up on what's really important about being a human.
Okay. I think that's a good sentiment to end the podcast episode on. And of course, the last thing, as always, what's that synthwave art? And it was just the prompt was wage slavery in the modern era, and it gave
Mm.
us that. So
They're not
it
subtle,
no,
eh?
not
Not
subtle at
subtle at
all.
all. They've got some
Uh,
high vis in there, I can say that. So they're obviously
yes,
working class. They do appear to not be white as well. I'll just put that out there.
yeah,
They have some very
definitely black. This person's
definitely
black.
distinct features there. I wonder what they're trying to say. What's with the red bonnet thingy, though? What do you reckon that's about?
um,
And it just makes me
Yeah.
think of the French revolutionaries, how they used to wear that like red cap and stuff like that.
Unless
But
that's
like
supposed
it's
to be some sort of lumberjack, but yeah, I don't
oh
know.
yeah, interesting. Sorry, what was the prompt again?
It was wage slavery in the modern era.
In the modern era, right? I guess
Yeah.
that's yeah, interesting. Interesting.
Okay. And with that, remember everyone to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, Mr. A.
Thank you very much for IS. And to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are MysterE.